Hello, my name is Angelina Talley-Rainey and I'm the Head of Design and Technology at the Highfield School. I'm going to talk to you today about using NotebookLM to create podcasts to support classroom activities and exam revision. Firstly, I wanted to start with the pros and cons of NotebookLM. So I think it's a really good way to diversify the offer of activities which are presented to our students. So it definitely does break up some of those lessons which can be quite teacher-led. It also enables you to generate resources really quickly, and the ability to differentiate those resources based on age, reading ability, EAL status, etc., is very quick. However, the cons are that you really need to check each output that it produces just to make sure it's relevant for the intended activity and the group you'd like to use it with. This can be quite time consuming, and it also does take quite a bit of time to learn how the website functions. And as time goes on, it does change quite rapidly. So, for example, since I've started using the website, it has added four new functions. I'll discuss those a little bit later on. And lastly, you need to be really explicitly clear with the input you provide to NotebookLM in order to generate those relevant resources and activities. Otherwise, it can go off on quite a bit of a tangent. Um, Also, as you are using NotebookLM in the chat, I personally don't really like the chat function and the way that the output comes out. So I will always generate podcasts or mind maps, for example, using NotebookLM, and then I will create resources using Copilot or ChatGPT. That's just the way that I like to work, but the chat function might really work for you. So it's just a case of trial and error. So when you open up NotebookLM, it will show you this page and ask you to input your resources. You can do this by uploading from the desktop. In this case, your resources will need to be saved in a PDF format. You can also upload from Google Drive or specific website links like YouTube or specific extracts from text, which may be really suitable for English literature, screenplays and drama, or historical texts. But what I would say is if you are including links, just make sure that they are relevant to your intended activity. On the right-hand side of the original box for your input, there is a Discover Sources button. If you click this, it will scour the internet for sources based on the resources you've already uploaded on the previous screen, and it will pull anything from the internet that it thinks will be relevant. As you can see here in this case, the top source there is Wikipedia, which might not be the most reliable source. So I'd urge some caution with this tool, and just ensure you're checking the relevance and reliability of any websites you are using. So once you've uploaded your resources, it will arrive on the left-hand side tab, and it will have small ticks next to it, which will indicate to NotebookLM which of those resources you'd like it to reference when it's creating your podcast or your resource. You don't need to tick every single one if you don't want it referenced in the output. In the middle here, you've got the chat box. So the main paragraph there is a summary from NotebookLM of the resources you've already given it. At this stage, I haven't actually started using the chat yet, but this is where you would ask it to create specific activities like gap fills or exam questions. On the right-hand side there are six different functions of NotebookLM. The main activity I use it for are the podcasts and mind maps. There is quite a good function to generate videos, but I think that's still in the development stage personally. The videos it creates are like PowerPoints, which have a speaker narrating each slide, which may be useful for those students who require alternative provision. You can also make quizzes, reports, and flashcards, which you might find suitable depending on what sort of group you are using this with. When you go to generate your audio, there's a pen icon on the right-hand side, which will allow you to customize it. And then this box will come up. I like to use this tool instead of just clicking on the purple box because it allows you to really streamline what I want in the podcast and what I want it to speak about. There are four main formats for a podcast. You can have a deep dive, a brief, a critique, or a debate. The critique or debate functions might be really useful for your high attainers or A-level students who might require that extra context around a topic or a more critical view and understanding. For my classes, I prefer to deep dive because it's a conversation between two people. It is quite good because it sounds like a real podcast. I personally think the brief podcasts are a bit too brief, and I don't think the students engage as well with this as they do with a deep dive. The first thing you need to do is choose the format that you want to create your podcast in, and then decide on the length, which will either be shorter, default, or longer. The default setting usually lasts between 15 to 25 minutes. If it is that long, I usually direct my students to listen to a particular section. So, for example, 5 to 10 minutes for a particular activity, which they will do independently on their devices. You can also choose the language you'd like to output this in. The main benefit of the customized tool is the fact that you can specify key focus points, though, that you want in that podcast, which you can just see there at the bottom. Um, so, for example, if you have a particular worksheet or questions that you'd like your students to answer, you can specify it in the box at the bottom there. It will also allow you to tailor the podcast for your classes. So you can ask NotebookLM to make it suitable for a Year 10 mixed ability group with reading ages of 11 to 15, studying the WJEC hospitality and catering specification. It's really important at this stage to be specific with your input and be clear on the intended purpose of your activity. I'd also suggest that you ask it to speak slowly. Some feedback from my students is that when they are listening to it, they speak a little bit too quickly sometimes, and then they struggle to keep pace without pausing it very frequently. Once you've generated your audio, it will appear on the tab there underneath your other options. There is a cool mode on it called interactive mode, which allows you to speak to the AI podcast host and ask it questions. So your voice is also in the podcast. You don't have to use that though. You can just download it as it is. At this stage, you can also change the playback speed to be slower or faster. I found that I needed to convert the audio using Cloud Convert to an MP3 file before inserting this into my Google Slides. Otherwise, it doesn't necessarily work when you try to insert it. So this is an example of an input that I recently used. You can see here that I specifically asked the AI to make this suitable for a Year 12 mixed ability group studying the AQA textile specification. I wanted the AI to focus on key themes, textile techniques, and to reference social, moral, and cultural messaging throughout the artwork that I wanted it to speak about. So once I generated that podcast, this is just an example of the classroom activity that I will use with my students. I introduced the artist at the start of the lesson, and we had a brief discussion around some key themes and what that actually meant to them. I then asked them to listen to the podcast and work independently to make notes on the key themes identified on the board as a list there. I asked them to do this either as notes or a mind map around the image. So, this is a transcript from the audio podcast. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to embed this in the video to show you. However, I did just want to highlight that it does sound like a conversation between two hosts. So that you can see here that they start with a question: is this a visual thing or is there more to it? The second host then goes on to describe the artwork that we are speaking about in a lot more detail and referencing those key themes of symbolism. So, oranges symbolizing health and prosperity. It then reverts back to the first host who wants to ask them about expanding on particular themes. So, in this case, they're asking them about using fabric as layers for skin tone. The second host then comes back and as replies as they would in a normal conversation. I've found that these activities have been really engaging for my students and it enables them to think more deeply about topics and key themes, especially at A level. So once I'd created the original podcast, I listened to it back and noticed that there's quite some high level technical language for those students. I have a Ukrainian student in my class. So instead of just making the podcast in Ukrainian, I asked the chat to transcribe the podcast into Ukrainian for me. The transcript appeared in the chat and I copied and pasted that over to a Word document and just printed out a copy. I asked my student to listen to the podcast in English and said to her, if you need to check back or if there's anything you don't understand, try and use the transcript here to contextualize what you're hearing. After she'd done this activity, what I found was that this student was listening to the podcast and was occasionally checking back to the transcript. And we had a really good conversation afterwards as a class that actually she felt really empowered to contribute to. And when I asked her for feedback afterwards, like about the transcript, she said she found it really useful to be able to read it in her own language, and then kind of go between the English podcast and then the Ukrainian transcript. So once you've input all of your material, if you then wanted to do a revision session later on, you can create mind maps, which will be created based on those original input resources. You could use this as a recap activity for your students to start off a mind map on key topics. All of this will be saved into NotebookLM under different notebooks, which you can find later on, and they are all linked to your login. What I would say about the mind maps is that it doesn't go into a lot of detail. So it might be a really good start to a mind map that you may need to build on and add more detail through class discussion or as a whole class activity. When you are using NotebookLM to make resources, you can do that in the chat there, just at the bottom. Personally, I prefer to use Copilot or ChatGPT because the output is slightly easier to use. So, for an example, in Copilot, the output will arrive as a Word document, whereas in NotebookLM, you will need to make that into a document yourself. In that chat here, I've asked it to create me a specific activity based on the selected sources. So in this case, I've asked it to create me a gap fill exercise as a worksheet with a heading, list of words and blank spaces. However, it didn't make it as a document for me, so I had to copy and paste it over into another one into a usable format. Obviously, it's fine if you're happy to do that, but it's just an example of how the functionality of the different websites all work. Once you've asked NotebookLM for your resources, it will come out in the chat underneath where you've asked it the question. In this case, it gave me about 4 pages worth of gap fill activities. This is great because I didn't use it all at once, so I pushed this out over the scheme of work so that we could do this as do now tasks or revision activities for homework. You can also ask NotebookLM for things like exam style questions and answers. But it is really important that you are specific with your input here and ask it for specific styles of questions. Link this to your exam boards, student age, and ability, and the questions that come out will be much more tailored to the exam questions that they'll get in the real paper. This is an example of how I use this with some of my exam groups. So, the environmental health officer is a really key topic in the hospitality and catering specification. So, I wanted to do a revision session ahead of their exams. I started with the images here, which I created using Canva AI, so that we can have a quick discussion about what we remember, because we would have done this topic many moons ago in the scheme of work. I then ask the students to complete the revision clock, where you have 5 minutes to recall knowledge about 4 key subtopics and jot that down in a black pen. So that's done with no revision guides, just pure memory. I then ask the students to listen to the recording and fill in any information in a green pen. I've then done a final roundup in a whole class discussion where students fill in any additional information that they've missed, which they, in this case, did in a red pen. As you can see here, I asked the students to listen from 0 to 8 minutes of the podcast, and then I saved the rest for a different activity. So this is an example of the student output from this activity. What you can see here is that this particular student remembered 2 to 3 points, which are in the black pen in the top 2 boxes, but actually there's nothing in the other 2 boxes. This was expected as we hadn't done this topic in quite a long time. Overwhelmingly, though, this student has written in green pen here, which indicates to me that they've taken quite a lot of information from the podcast. There's a small amount of red pen here, which means that during that final roundup phase, they were able to gain additional insights through that class discussion and some further questioning. This makes it really clear to me how much information they've gained through that activity. And actually, in this example, this student achieved really well in the final 8 mark question, which came up on the paper. What I got from student feedback is that they did enjoy this activity. And I think it was a good break for them to listen to voices that weren't necessarily mine in the classroom. And it's like they're listening to a conversation between 2 people. And I found that a lot of my students are already listening to things like YouTube or Spotify podcasts, so that they're used to that format of receiving information. They also quite liked being able to rewind and catch things that they didn't hear. So originally, I'd allotted about 10 minutes for this activity, but I found that they were asking for longer so they could rewind and capture more information in their notes. So I just wanted to end with some top tips for using Notebook LM. Firstly, be really specific with your input and include things like age groups, exam boards, specifications, and be really clear on the intent of your activity that you are trying to create. Secondly, just do one activity at a time. I feel that if we use too many of these, our students will get podcast out. So just try one group, one activity, and see where that leads you. And lastly, resilience is key. So this does take a little bit of time to get used to. But once you get your head around this, I feel like this is something that is quite powerful and will have a big impact in the classroom. Thank you so much for listening.